From Sattva Knowledge Institute, this is Decoding Impact, the podcast where we apply systems thinking in conversation with extraordinary experts to understand what it truly takes to scale solutions in the social sector. Decoding Impact is hosted by Ratish Balakrishnan, a co-founder and managing partner at Sattva. Welcome to today's episode.
India has a significantly low women workforce participation rate with over 80% of the women out of the workforce. Only 2.5% of women are employed in the formal sector. The rest of them lack decent working conditions and access to minimum wages. The worrying sign is that things seem to be getting worse. India slipped 88 places from 112 to 140 in the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Report 2021. The reasons for the skewed labor workforce participation are due to a wide range of socio-cultural factors. According to PLFS 2021, nearly 80% of the women attribute their absence from the labor workforce to being engaged in domestic duties, making the unpaid labor economy a central theme for the discourse on women's economic participation. In this podcast episode, we want to understand the challenges behind low female labor workforce participation and deep dive into the methods to understand and address some of these challenges. To discuss this, we have Sona Mitra with us. Sona is currently the Principal Economist at IWWAGE and lead at Krea University. Sona specializes in research on gender and labor development, economics, public policy, and labor statistics. Sona, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Ratish. Thank you so much.
So this is a very, very important topic, and I was recently reading how when you look at the contours of countries that have achieved significant economic progress, one of the crucial factors across countries like even Bangladesh and China is really the role of women in the economy. That when the market or the economy is poised to grow, the percentage of women that are already in the labor workforce has a significant impact on how far are economic returns amplified and how well does that impact poverty. So I'm so glad I'm talking to you about this topic, and the numbers have been quoted multiple times, and I've often felt that the deeper nuances behind this issue has not been discussed as much. Yeah, so a lot of our discussion, I'd love to sort of get into some of the weeds with you since you've spent so much time thinking about it. Before we get into the topic itself, Sona, I'd love to hear from you about your background so far. What have you done and what has brought you here to this conversation?
Thanks, Ratish. Thanks for setting up the context on this on this topic, which is very close to heart. And I have been into this topic for since the time I was a student considering doing a PhD around this topic. And it was around in the early 2000s when the entire discourse on, the developing Asia and China getting the workforce getting feminized, especially in the manufacturing sector, where feminization was very much apparent in China and other Southeast Asian countries. And even in South Asia, India was an exception. It was globally very, very well integrated around in the early 2000s and continued to be integrated with the global trade and global trade patterns. But we could see that there were exceptions in the Indian trends, which were not following the usual patterns of what we find in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, in China, other Southeast Asia. And that is, and it is around from then onwards. So it's almost 2 decades since the time I have spent in actually looking at the trends in women's workforce participation, women's labor force participation in India, and try to understand the reasons behind this low-level rigidity that is there in the labor force participation rate of women in India. There are several factors that influence this rigidity. But so yes, I am an economist by training. I have not done anything else ever other than economics since my undergraduate. And I have been associated with the Initiative for What Works to Advance Women and Girls in the Economy for the last 4 years now, since its inception. And I thought when the initiative was being launched, I thought that was the place, because it was actually questioning centered around questioning all the reasons around women's labor force participation, something that I have been doing at that period for the last 1.5 decades. So it seemed very right for me to be in the place. And yeah, that's a brief thing about me.
Thank you, Sona. Thank you so much. I wanted to talk to you about the point that you made, and I think the word you used was rigidity, right? And because it is always, it's always understood that, okay, in developed countries, women are working and so on. But when I read about, as you rightly made the point, even in countries like Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, etc., which have been at some point part of India, the subcontinent, or have the same cultural context, it then becomes harder for us to understand and explain why do we have the behavior we have in India today. Can you maybe tell us a little bit more about the point on rigidity that you mentioned? What are some of the structural constraints that are stopping women to be part of the labor force?
So South Asia has always had a very different history than compared to the other parts of the world. And it has been, and the colonial history was very important. It influenced a lot of the economic structures of the country, which are things that have taken a long time to actually have been overcome by the economic development and the rapid economic growths that we have had. But in some cases, we have seen that these economic growth patterns have actually excluded some of the marginal sections of the population. Women's labor force participation, I would consider as one of the marginal elements that got excluded in this entire growth process of the region. And while Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, more or less shares very similar social norms and social and cultural practices, also are very homogeneous in terms of their other cultural habits, I would say that there is a traditional and conservative practices that are present in all these countries, which has pulled back women for a very long time. Now, Sri Lanka and Bangladesh has experienced a very different way of including women into their labor force. In India, because it's a very big country and parts of Sri Lanka resemble the south of India, the practices there, and Bangladesh being more closer to the Eastern Indian practices. So those also vary, right? And therefore, what we find is that this rigidity around low labor force participation in India is actually a historical thing, which is embedded in its cultural practices. While Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, in a different context, has been able to transcend that, in India, we have a lot more to do in order to be able to move a little more ahead on women's labor force participation.
Before I come to India, I'm intrigued by what you said, which is they found another way to integrate women. There has been a lot written today about Bangladesh, participation of women in garment industry that has thrived, etc. Sri Lanka in a different way. And I think I find this fascinating that you mentioned about how these countries are neighbors to a context of India, which is Sri Lanka to the south of India, where, there might be more similarities, Bangladesh to the east. Two questions from my side. One, it'll be great to hear, any insights from your side on how have they actually integrated women in the workforce? Are there lessons for us to learn from? And two, from what you said, even in India, do you see a skew in the labor force participation and the social norms and behaviors that are distinct for south to the east to the north? And is there something to learn from that as well?
Yes, I'm going to basically answer. I think you'll get your answer from your first question. The second question would be answered as I answered the first part in terms of what has happened in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. So Sri Lanka is very, very, the Sri Lankan, if you look at the states of Tamil Nadu or Andhra, these are two states with higher workforce participation rates of women in India. Sri Lanka and close to the numbers that we see in Sri Lanka. Now, what has happened in Sri Lanka? Sri Lanka has also globalized in a way that India has. But the globalization has been done in different ways. So the Indian global integration pattern was very much linked with the the globalization was driven by the service sector, especially the IT related, banking, finance, very tertiary sectors. Whereas in Sri Lanka, we find that the globalization was actually driven by the manufacturing, the industrial sectors, and also a service-led globalization where there was a very high rate of migration and migration of women. So therefore, the work participation rates of women in the industrial sector, especially when they were integrating themselves with the global export-oriented sectors of garments and electronics in Sri Lanka, those sectors actually started absorbing a lot of women into the workforce. And that increased the work participation rates in the country. Also, Sri Lanka became a great place for out-migration of women into the Gulf countries as domestic helpers. In fact, they started giving competition to the Philippines. And if we look at how Sri Lanka has used the opportunity of out-migration of women as women workers as domestic help in the Gulf countries, we would find that there are actually, they actually train their women. There are centers, there are a lot of, in fact, and those centers are not only private centers. Those centers have been started by the this entire push by the government in terms of training women to learn using household appliances, gadgets, how to be a qualified, trained domestic help who would be basically out migrating and earning remittances for the country. And that also in way increased the work participation rates of women. So here we have the industry and the services globalizing in a different way and that resulting in increasing women's work participation. In Bangladesh, on the other hand, women have always been working. In Tamil Nadu, if we look at the history of the southern Indian women's workforce participation has always been higher. Women have worked outside the households, and it is very similar. It was very similar in Sri Lanka, and that helped transcend this. And globalization basically facilitated this entire context of women being able to move out easily. On the other hand, in Bangladesh, a primarily agrarian economy like we have in West Bengal, Odisha, and Bihar, women are very much integrated into the rice fields. And in Bangladesh, on the other hand, actually, the two things I would say that helped in pushing women out of agriculture into the other sectors. One was definitely the push in the export-oriented garment manufacturing, which actually involves a whole lot of women. And this is also observed in some parts of India, localized increases in women's work participation, where there are very, very connected, globally integrated export zones or export-oriented garment manufacturing setups. For example, Tirupur in Tamil Nadu. So we find this very similar to what happened in Bangladesh, that the global garment manufacturing industry blossomed a lot, bloomed a lot. The government, of course, provided a lot of efforts. I mean, the efforts of the government in terms of facilitating export industries, garment export industries to come and set up their businesses, come and set up their workshops, factory floors in the country, helped in pulling women out of those rice fields into the garment sector. Also, the second thing in Bangladesh was the microfinance initiative, that the Grameen Bank initiative that actually took Bangladesh by a storm, and a large section of the beneficiaries were women who went into this Grameen Bank microfinance initiative, set up their own cooperatives, own self-help groups, and really moved out of agriculture, which is something that could not happen in the other Eastern Indian context like West Bengal, Orissa, or Bihar. So, of course, economic growth, globalization policies to push export-oriented growth pattern, all of this affected, and hence we find the difference where Bangladesh could also transcend and include more women into the workforce, whereas we could not do that in India.
Women constitute 48% of the country's. Want to understand this a little bit more deeper. One, as you were talking, something that I realized, and this is something I've read before, is that over a period of time, socially, some industries become acceptable for women to be a part of, And actually, they mentioned that sometimes results in decline of men coming into those industries. And as those industries thrive, the participation of women in the labor force starts to thrive. So you gave the example of garments. In Tamil Nadu, that's been the case. It's true in Bangladesh as well, services sector, and so on. So one, I just wanted to confirm that with you to say, is there, in the way we think about women labor force participation, is there a way to sort of look at which industries are most friendly for women socially and helping those industries specifically grow for us to be able to drive this, number one. And two, I wanted to also ask you that there is also an underlying norms around migration of women to another country, for example. Sri Lanka is able to do it. They even train women for it, etc. I don't know if there has been any research that helps identify how these norms shift or get established in a country where it becomes acceptable for a society to be able to allow that to do, for it to happen at scale. So two questions. One is more on the supply of jobs side, which is, is there a way to make industries that are women friendly to scale? Is that a strategy for us to look at labor force participation? The other one is more a demand side, which is, are there ways Sri Lanka has addressed this whole norms and behaviors, or Bangladesh has done it, where we have something to learn from?
If you ask me that why some sectors are gender friendly, women friendly, I would say that it stems directly from history. If we look at the historical activities of women, and we'll find that even in the global north, and this I'm talking about the period very, very, very long ago, in the initial days of capitalism, when the factory system was being set up, even in those countries, some factories actually started to bring women into the factory shops, the factory shop floors. And those factories were essentially the garment factories, because one is that women were generally trained in, and they were also comfortable in dealing with garments and textiles, because women would otherwise at home produce yarns, spin yarns, produce cloths, and also stitch. And that kind of work, the activities, the skills that they already had, which was very useful for some of the garment factories, and women were being absorbed. Now, when these garment factories, during the globalization period from the 1970s, 80s, 90s, the peak period and the best period of the globalizing economies, when these big chains started shifting their production to the developing world, for example, in the Latin American and the Southeast Asian economies, the developing Asia that we call, when they started shifting, one of the important things was that they had an experience of dealing with women working on the shop floors, working on the factory shop, sweatshop, in the sweatshops. And also there was a large number of women workforce, which was workforce available to work in these factories at very cheap wages, because these women were working in the field and they were underemployed. The returns from the rice field or the agrarian field was much lesser, and when they got into the factories, they would earn better, they would live a dignified life, they would have an increase in their decision-making powers within the families, and the families also, households enjoyed the incomes that women would bring from the factories. And there is a whole range of widely researched areas in all this, which actually show that women in garment is a very historical thing, and that has developed and that has helped the export-oriented garment industry so much that women have been captured. The reserve army of women have been captured, and they have been really useful in terms of pushing this entire, feminization of the garment industries. So that is already there. In the current context, what we can see is how, and coming to your question about how those were transcended, those norms and challenges, I think that the entire question of being able to earn incomes and that is a very crucial factor, earn incomes from activities is something that actually has helped in challenging norms in always. And that helped in women being able to participate in the factory shop floors. And once they did it for the garments, then there were a range of factories that women thought were very safe for them, and there were demands from the industry also. For example, electronics, where they needed nimble fingers of women to really assemble small small elements in the electronic goods. And it started from watch factories, from television, and went up to the mobile phones, the smart gadgets and devices, where the nimble fingers are needed, women with nimble. And those demand from the sectors actually also helped in pulling women into some of the industries. Now, once those inhibitions were broken initially at the garment factories, it actually worked for women to move from one sector into another.
This is very interesting, Sona, and thank you. I'm from Kerala, and as you were talking, I was also thinking about how nurses from Kerala are today an acceptable profession for migration. I don't know if there is a general, norm change, but if you're going to be a nurse or a teacher, for example, there is a greater social acceptability of pursuing that occupation both in your local economy or outside. And the same thing is for outmigration to the Middle East in Kerala, right? And so it's fascinating to see how some of these behaviors and norms are maybe not generic, but there is a legitimacy to a particular industry that then allows women in Orissa to move to Bangalore for jobs or apparel, women in Kerala to move to as nurses to the east of India, etc. And I want to touch upon this at a later point in time and come back to this when we talk about solutions. You gave us a fascinating view of Sri Lanka, Bangladesh. If I had to sort of ask you to zone into India now and talk about what is missing and what are the norms, and I think that will probably lead us to the unpaid work conversation. But before we get there, what are some of the structural challenges socially, economically today that are stopping women to work in India?
Okay, so I think this has to be answered in nuances, but I would say I would answer it in two parts, actually. If we look at the problem of women's labor force participation in India, there is a problem of low labor force participation in India, and that is something that has been with us since independence. We have not really been able to increase the labor force participation of women, even despite the fact that India has been one of the most rapidly growing economies in the world. From 2000 to 2012, it actually was resilient to the global financial crisis. It was it did not get affected as badly as the global north during the very bad period of global financial crisis. But what we did during that period was something where we could have actually focused on including more women into the labor force, thinking of the problem of low labor force participation of women very seriously, and maybe given a boost to the manufacturing industries. Even when we were growing rapidly, the growth was coming, and you would know it better, because the growth was coming from the IT-enabled services, the service sector, the tertiary sector, very high value-added sectors. India was excelling in software development. All of these sectors are very high-skilled sectors, very high-value return sectors, and these sectors were those which intrinsically did not have the ability of absorbing labor. These are very low labor-intensive sectors, and in that, of course, the space for women are very less. And therefore, what we found was, while we were globally integrating as fast as possible, while we did not focus on manufacturing industries, especially sectors like food processing, which could have grown, like garments, which could have been as developed as the Sri Lankan and the Bangladesh or the Vietnamese or the Thai and Cambodian garment industries, it developed for the local markets, but did not do so well in the export-oriented sector and therefore did not expand so well, like even like Turkey. So we missed that boat where we could have actually also been able to absorb or feminized the manufacturing sector. That's one. The second part, we started talking about women's work participation when we saw that that lower level was also starting to decline. And we got alarm bells in 2011-12 when we saw that, as you rightly said, that it went below 20% mark. Now, that was an alarm bell that what is happening, because the World Bank came out with a report that if we are losing out on women's participation, India would actually lose incomes worth in trillions of dollars, like $2.9 million would be something that would be added to the Indian GDP if the female labor force participation could be raised by just 2 to 3%. So that amount, so that kind of opportunity costs were being talked about, and that is when the entire focus went and really started speaking about women's labor force participations declining. Again, here we are at a point after 10 years of that discourse, is that we are talking about bringing in more women into the labor force in several manners, but we are not really talking about how to challenge and how to think of it really in the long term to keep a sustainable way of having a women's labor force which is over 30 to 35%, which is going to really put India on a high growth path. So my entire understanding or my entire thing about women's labor force participation is not only about empowering women, it is also a lot about being able to get into the economic growth path, the high economic growth path. So that is where also the entire question of low labor force participation as well as declining labor force participation of women becomes very, very important.
This is very useful, Sona. And I want to pick up the first point that you mentioned, because I really like what you said there about not thinking of this as just an agency of the women problem. It's a very important issue, but it's not the only issue. It has to tie into the economic growth path of the country more in a more integral manner. And the two things that you said, which I thought were important, and I want to build on that. The one point that you mentioned was the fact that industries that have grown in the decades that we've preceded us, have not included either industries that are inherently women friendly, or efforts haven't been made to make them more women friendly. So food processing, as you rightly said, phenomenal opportunity just given our agricultural output, hasn't happened. I know there's been a conversation many years, and I was part of a bunch of policy planning exercises in 2014 and 17 where they talked about food parks. But they haven't taken off as much. As you also rightly said, we have lost our competitive edge in garments to countries around us over the years. It's actually been declining in terms of our factory output. One is really that. And the two, and I think it's another extremely important point, is that it's not sufficient if an industry satisfies only domestic markets, because growth rates in such industries are often going to be limited and job creation is going to be limited. It is really when you're connected to global markets and have an export focus that true job creation actually happens, which we've seen in IT services today, which is partly the reason why we really have a middle class in India, which has grown because of that. I wanted to sort of push that idea a little further and get your thoughts on, are there industries that you see today where you think that there is an opportunity to actually unlock more jobs and be relevant to both the domestic markets and the global markets? And I want to get your thoughts specifically, Sona, on one of my favorite areas, which is the healthcare sector. COVID has actually made it very clear that our allied health workforce industry is far less equipped to address the demand that we have domestically, even forget global. There is a growing global market for health professionals. And it is, from whatever I see and understand, and also where I come from, an industry that is women friendly. Is there a real opportunity for us to look at the healthcare sector, given just the continuum of jobs that are available from home nurses right up to doctors, from a skill level, given the focus on gender in the sector and the gender friendliness, given the rapid demand that is growing both in India and global, for us to sort of look at that as an opportunity to increase women labor workforce participation, number one. And apart from healthcare, if there are other sectors that you think are ripe for such focused efforts for us to improve labor workforce participation, I'd love to hear that from you, Sona.
Definitely. And there are quite a few. Of course, the first one that comes is the public health. We have there is a shortage of actually there is a huge demand in this sector, and the entire allied health workforce, allied health workforce is something that has large share of women in all countries. If we look at it, even in India, if we look at it, we have allied healthcare workers where a large section and large share of that being women, especially even in those conditions where we probably do not really want to talk about the conditions in the rural areas, but even there we find that it is women who are actually leading as allied health workers. And there is a huge potential in the urban areas where women can be trained properly, and that ranges, as you very rightly said, that ranges from domestic needs, home needs, to the entire to the needs of specialized care. And that is where that is one place which has a very large potential of absorbing and including women. Then comes the care sectors. The care sectors are the sectors where, as you said, again, it is linked to the allied health workers, but it is also a separate sector. So nurses are part of the care sectors, but there are also other carers that are needed. Carers needed for sick and elderly, carers needed for children. And the care economy is a very big economy in all markets, in all countries, in all nations. The care economy is very important. It is big and it forms a large part. If one can actually talk about markets operating within the care economy, expanding job opportunities in terms of expanding job opportunities within that sector. For example, providing childcare facilities in the public-private sector, public-private partnership models. Those are places, if you give quality childcare services, those are sectors where one actually sees women participating in a large number. Apart from these traditional sectors, now these are traditional sectors because women are associated with care as caregivers, and therefore care economy, care sectors like health, childcare, teaching, all these spaces are, of course, can be expanded to include more women. But when there's a huge potential of women in the non-traditional sectors, the newer sectors as well, which we are actually associating nowadays with the digital. The digital revolution, which is being called as the fourth industrial revolution. In here, I find a lot of potential. I mean, in fact, the policymakers are also trying to understand how they could do that by introducing, there are several new gigs that can be introduced in order to include more women into the labor force by the use of technology and digital. So therefore, I would say that there is a huge potential in this entire I know we missed the boat in terms of expanding or integrating our garments. We missed the boat in terms of expanding and integrating our electronics industry. So we missed the boat on industrial expansion, but we are actually doing very well in terms of our services growth even now, which is again being driven by this digital revolution that we are pushing for. And in that, there is a huge potential for women to be included, especially in the gig work that we continuously keep talking about, where we can enable women entrepreneurs, we can enable women small scale businesses, we can even enable women to be part of multinational or big corporate platforms as partners, like we have for, just the one top of the mind example that comes out is for the urban company, where we have a lot of women using digital technology, using smart gadgets to be able to actually access income earning opportunities and therefore also be part of the labor force in the country. So there is a huge potential, but there are challenges in that because the gender digital literacy gap is very wide. And that needs to be closed if we are really moving from the traditional into the non-traditional sectors. So there is a potential of expanding the traditional sectors in ways that has not been that has not happened in the past, and there is a demand for that. And there are ways in which the new non-traditional sectors for women can also be expanded for women by skilling them in the right direction.
And it's a good sort of framing for us to talk about, the way we think about solutions. The first part, as you said, is existing traditional sectors where the social norms are acceptable, where it is already gender friendly. What can we do to scale it? As you rightly said, services plays in such models, including healthcare, teaching, etc., are useful models for us to look at. And especially now that we have looked at teaching as a gig profession, which is probably one of the biggest changes that has happened thanks to EdTech and others, where it's not connected to a school. There's probably greater flexibility for employment for people beyond the tuition circuit that used to be there and the school circuit that used to be there for teachers. So that was one pathway, which is how do we unlock more opportunities in the traditional circuit. The second pathway that you talked about was how do we enable women opportunities in non-traditional industries and leverage some of the digital tailwinds that are there in the economy that are unlocking gig markets. So that's the second model that I wanted to talk. I wanted to put a third pathway and really get your thoughts on this, Sona, which is we've also a lot of times when talking about women labor force participation, talk about women entrepreneurship. How can we look at women as small business owners, or any form of entrepreneurs, even if they're going to be at a small scale, can they both employ themselves and create jobs in small ways for their local communities, which possibly is a third way. And I want to ask you a question on the third one before going into the second pathway, which is the digital industry, because I think it's important to unlock. So I wanted to get your views, since you've had a larger view on this issue, saying, are there parallels in enabling entrepreneurship among women at scale as a way of solving the labor force participation? And I want to contextualize my question a little bit. I'm an entrepreneur myself, and I always see entrepreneurship as a high risk, high gain model. What people often may not recognize when they talk about it is the amount of risk it takes to do anything on your own, the capital that it requires, and also the support that it requires over a period of time for you to be able to sustain and grow the business. And even when Satwa had done a survey earlier around one of the studies that we did, we recognize that almost all women who were becoming an entrepreneur were at least had a certain level of financial security and familial support for them to be able to make that move. And I've always been skeptical about whether, in an environment where their participation in labor is so difficult and where the financial situation is precarious, is any form of entrepreneurship going to be a scalable model of enabling women labor force? Of course, mine's a very, sensory understanding of this topic from the outside. You've thought about it a lot more deeply, so I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Okay, so two parts to your... So one is on entrepreneurship and other one is on how do we... the first part of your question. So, Ratish, one of the things that I would like to actually highlight here is the gaps when we want to move out from the traditional accepted sectors, as I said, like care and those in amongst those traditional sectors, there are also those very vulnerable sectors like domestic work and all, where women are exploited a lot, but they are also concentrated a lot because they are. All the domestic workers are in India. And all of them are women coming from very, very poor households, poor backgrounds, and they are not exactly, they cannot be compared with with those women who are actually out migrating internationally for domestic work. So when we see Indonesian and Filipino women serving households in Singapore or in the Gulf countries, Sri Lankan women serving households in the Gulf countries, the conditions and the returns that they get, the conditions of work and the returns that they get are actually, conditions of work may be debatable, but returns that they get and the way they are trained are much different and better in terms of how we look at our entire women domestic workers segment, especially in the urban metropolitan areas. So what I'm saying is, there are gaps in skilling and training, not only for non-traditional digital gaps, but also for gaps that needs to be closed in these services that we have seen that can be done, and that we have seen that can be upskilling can happen in these traditional sectors as well, to provide better conditions of work and better earning abilities, earning capacities to these women. There is also this entire element of, in the non-traditional, if you want to break out from these traditional sectors and talk about, there is not only the digital gap, the digital literacy gap that we are talking about, there is also the gap. There are also gaps in terms of women's other skills. For example, platforms, the aggregator platforms like the cab services, the food home delivery services, the food delivery services. They are all dominated by men. And what we find is that wherever we have had localized interventions of training women to ride bikes or to ride two-wheelers or to drive four-wheelers, it has actually helped in terms of them being able to get into those. So skilling is what I'm trying to say is, skilling also has to be for women in non-traditional sense. Skilling in, one can skill women in care, upgrade their skills, but one has to also let women enter those non-traditional skilling segments. And there, one needs to not only skill them and leave them at that, but they have to also be able, the norms and the norms have also to be changed. Rightly, when you said that women from Orissa moved to Bangalore, it never happened earlier, right? It is happening only when we find that actually there had been programs of the government where the apprenticeship of girls, after being trained as apprentices in the garment sector, and then that apprenticeship actually linked themselves to the factories in Bangalore. And that is how the change started. And that is how it broke the norms. That is how policies worked. And that is how then the private sector took it up. So basically, there is a way in which we can capture the demands of the industries and map it to the gaps that women have, and then they talk about putting women, skilling women to close those gaps. On the other question, now entrepreneurship is a very different ballgame. It is a very, very important engine for improving the women's labor force participation. And this is something that has not been tapped as a potential in our country. I'll give you one figure, and this is a little old, but it has not changed much over the years. It is a 2014-15 figure where we found that women, those women who are actually termed as entrepreneurs are women who are running businesses just on their own without any hired workers. And more than 80% of women's businesses are actually without any hired workers run by them, which actually shows the scale of business. Small, but more secured. Women are risk averse. Surveys and studies have shown surveys and studies trying to talk about training women into entrepreneurship have shown that women are less risk averse. Women are more risk averse. They try to get into live opportunities which do not really, which would give them some secured returns. And for that, they are all, for that, there has been a tendency of having businesses that are sustained at a very low scale. It has not been able to upscale. So when we are talking about women's entrepreneurship in India, there is a long way to go in terms of being able to make the businesses sustainable, being able to scale up the businesses that women run. It is very much in the comparisons are very different when we make a male-female comparison. The gender gaps in entrepreneurship is very, very stark. Entrepreneurship has worked in several countries of the global north, but in countries like India, where we still have women operating at nano and micro scales, where they cannot afford to really hire in workers, hire in their establishment. While there is a huge potential, we at least cannot claim that entrepreneurship can become an engine of labor force improvement in India immediately. There has to be a lot of, again, the infrastructural gaps have to be closed, the skill gaps have to be closed. Women need to be skilled in managerial and technical and accounting abilities. Women needs to be, IWWAGE's own work has shown that when women establishment are actually more suited to hire women prefer more women. But there is also this part that women do not really prefer to hire, and women, they want to remain at low scale, want to remain risk averse, want to remain into a scale where a secured rate of return comes to them for years, so they can plan well. So there are many nuances when we talk about women's entrepreneurship. There are demand side issues, there are supply side issues, there are gaps, and there are also issues about access to capital, access to credits, access to working capital, in fact. So all of these things, and the ways in which the saving mechanisms, the investments mechanisms, skills, these exclude women, the knowledge that exclude women, there is a huge gap, and there is a huge potential if we can close this gap and move ahead.
One point I wanted to make is that I fully agree with you that to limit women's labor force participation only to the traditional sectors that we have is definitely not a good strategy for us as a country. I think to be able to open as many opportunities as possible, I think is critical. And I'm sure, as you would agree, it's not an either or. I think we should do all of these. And as you were talking, I'm also realizing that the level of uncertainty in each of these pathways that we discussed, is going to be different. In a traditional pathway, the social norms are probably not as much of a challenge. The acceptability of women is not as much of a challenge. But as you rightly said, skilling is a challenge. The quality of decent work and the working conditions they might have is a challenge. And I think we need to address that. In the second model, social norms is a challenge because, getting women to access digital. The industry acceptance is going to be a challenge, and the skilling is going to be a challenge. But if there was ever a time to be able to solve this problem, it's probably now. And I want to talk about the tailwinds there with you. On the entrepreneurship side, as you said, there is the mindset issue of not really looking at scale and employing people. There is also the challenge of access to credit, capital, and then normative challenges there. There is also other, external factors and internal skilling needs. So the level of uncertainty in entrepreneurship is probably the highest among the three pathways that we discussed. You started by saying it's a very strong, engine of jobs. And I would love to understand from you, have you seen any pockets where it's working well, where either in a state or in a sector or in a value chain or in a country outside of India, which is in the developing context, comparable social milieu, where entrepreneurship has created a significant value in terms of labor force participation of women. Because I think, as you rightly said, the potential is great, but my only concern as I was listening to you is that the challenges seem far more than the first and the second pathway that we discussed.
So what we see is a large part of women's businesses are actually home-based businesses. They are operating from their own home or adjacent homestead lands. Homestead where there is a workshop and they are just working from there if the scale is slightly larger. Otherwise, they are working from their home. And what is this business about? Predominantly about it is part of the food processing culture. It is part of the history in which women have actually processed their own produces. And here, what we find is women making pickles, women making papad, women are engaged and in rolling agarbattis. Women are actually doing a whole lot of these businesses. And they do it with the help of the self-help groups. So there is a whole connection between the power of women's collectives and how well women get networked in terms of sustaining their businesses, these small scale businesses. They are very willing to be part of networks, very willing to be part of collectives, and do not really operate by themselves because the networks, the collectives give them that financial security. Here we are talking about the large section of women small businesses who we are actually who cannot be classified as entrepreneurs, but that is what we have as women small business women. This is where we are, and this is where our energy should be in terms of training. And what we find is manufacturing, retail, food packaging, education, all of these sectors are the ones where we have women operating. So sector-wise, if you're asking me, what are the areas where women are working as, in businesses, are manufacturing, retail trade. Now, what is retail trade? Again, women petty retailers, like, owning a cart, owning a little space in a market, or owning a little space on the roadside where they are selling their vegetables or fishes or some other wares. Then women into education, like, women having set up businesses of private tuition. So all these are sectors where we find these small businesses. If we talk about exceptions here, now the exception is a woman who would lie actually in the medium to the large. So we have examples of the likes of Indra Nui or Kiran Majumdar-Shaw, or the likes of our own, the very Nika example. And they are again at the very large scale, very, very large scale. What can be done actually is to inflate the middle and really help those small women businesses to move into that middle, to transcend that nano and micro scale and move into the medium scale. And that is going to really help to scale up and therefore create more job opportunities for others. Because, as I said, that examples, women enterprises have a tendency of hiring more women. So that can then become an engine of labor force participation.
We've been talking through this conversation about women as an individual acting in the economy. So I think the pathway number one is women working as an individual contributor, either as a person in a job and so on. Pathway number two was women leveraging the gig economy. Pathway number three is where we looked at women as a network, like collective enterprises that can be formed. Is there a pathway number four where the family is the unit of engagement and livelihood, and women are an integral part of it, where their rights are recognized, where we don't solve for women to join work as an individual, but a family to join work where a woman is an equal participant in the economic activity? I know this has been a thought, in certain parts where land holdings, where women are equal participants at work, but they're not often recognized. In my own experience, when I know that, in traditional business families, when men start jobs, women often start to contribute to that as well. What is the general thinking around looking at these models where the family is a unit that's participating in livelihood, that in turn means women join the work as well? I'd love to hear your thoughts on both the upsides of such an idea and also potential downsides as well.
So we do have a large share of women who are actually contributing to the family enterprises. Those women are classified by the official labor force statistics as unpaid family helpers. And the share of that within the total employment of women is almost around 30%. So that's a huge share, right? Absolutely. Which actually means that there are ways in which women are contributing to the productive economic gains. And but the downside of that is actually that earnings from family businesses or earnings for their own contribution to the family business is something that they do not really get, which is also a fact that has come out from the surveys. It goes into the family. The earnings are as family earnings. It is not an individual earning. And what we see here is that women getting individual earning has a very, very different impact on the overall well-being of a household, on challenging the norms within cultural practices within the household, has a very important impact on children. And therefore, people like us who have spent a lot of time thinking about women's agency empowerment linked to their labor contributions have not really been enthused by the whole concept of unpaid family workers, because the earnings do not come to the women. They do not have control over those earnings, because when we see women have control over their own incomes, the expenditure patterns, the consumption patterns of households change. The expenditures are more on healthcare, on children's care, children's education, which doesn't really happen when they do not have control over the earnings, over the incomes. And that is why I did not talk about that unpaid family worker thing, and it is a very personal opinion of mine, but an opinion which is endorsed by which is also endorsed by a lot.
So we started by saying how countries with similar cultural milieu as us, which is Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, have over the last few decades been able to create opportunities for women. And part of what they were able to do was to identify sectors of growth for their country which were women friendly. And you created very specific pathways across, training, enablement, etc., that enabled the women to unlock those opportunities when the demand was available. Classic example is the point you made about domestic help in Sri Lanka working abroad and how the state enabled pathways for them to be able to do it, women in garments working in Bangladesh and so on. And we sort of made the point around how there are traditional industries that are ideally being friendly for women, and how in India we've missed the boat in helping those industries grow that have had a direct impact on women labor force participation. We then moved on to saying there are non-traditional industries that are actually ideal for women to work in, like the gig workers and so on, where access to specific skills and services can actually help them unlock those opportunities at scale. And the digital economy today is a great example of that. We then moved on to talking about collective enterprises and saying how looking at entrepreneurship as a model in cases where formal markets stop to work is a great opportunity, and how these businesses might be dwarf businesses, they might not grow, but creating them at scale helps. And number two, there is the highest end unicorn models, and then there are super nano models. How do we create a middle layer of enterprises that can actually create jobs for women, I think is critical. The last part we discussed was home-based models, and you highlighted clearly, while that is 30% of the workforce today, there is an inherent system which disadvantages women in terms of both calling out capital that they can call their own, calling out work and standards of work that they have to maintain there, and so on. Where I think, and like I've been informally mentioning to you, maybe there's a part two to this conversation as well. Now, even if we sort of stick to the first three pathways, Sona, and what we can do, one point you've constantly made, and I want to summarize a few things you've said so that you can build on it. Meaningful skilling is going to be very important. Skilling on technical roles and skills, skilling on digital, skilling on business and accounting, skilling on various aspects that enable women to be effective. So that's one critical recommendation that you've highlighted multiple times in the conversation today, which I think is very relevant. Second, you've highlighted the idea of pathways. When we spoke about girls from Orissa coming to Kerala or coming to Karnataka, you talked about how apprenticeship models that connected to industry sort of eased the transition from training to apprenticeship towards formal employment, towards outbound migration, which ensured that there was a proper continuity between training and actual jobs. And so creating such pathways, especially in non-traditional industries, probably is going to be very, very important. I also wanted to get your thoughts on what other critical things and priorities do you think we should focus on as a country when we think about this problem, so that we have a more holistic solution than piecemeal ideas that work individually.
We did not touch upon the most important thing that actually enables women to access labor force participation, access labor force, and that is actually something around the. I mean, it is not exactly the part of the cultural practices or norms. It is, but they are very much linked to each other, and it is the entire, the model of women as primary caregivers of the economy. I mean, that kind of increases the whole, I would rather say there is this moral thing associated with women having to take care of all the household responsibilities. Now, even if a woman is actually running her own business, is empowered in her own right, the managing the household, taking care of children, deciding on the daily activities, planning for the day, planning for the meals, everything is something that a woman does. And that role is something that has not really changed over the years. And that is where we come to the thing about women's unpaid work. The time spent on doing these household management and household duties, and the duties of the duties of the elderly, sick, and children within the household takes away a whole lot of time for women. A time, if can be reduced effectively by certain measures, can actually provide some more time, free time to women in order to be able to contribute meaningfully into the economy. And therefore, that is going to really raise the labor force participation of women. So unpaid work has come up as a big barrier and a major issue for women to be able to access labor markets seamlessly.
You shared the unpaid work, and I'm saying that's a much longer conversation with you that I'd love to have at some point, which is the supply side. And I think it's important that you raised it. I was also wondering, since we've had a very strong demand focus so far, are there other demand side interventions that can come in? We talked about skilling, we talked about pathways. Are there other things that we need to do? For example, I know access to credit has come up, but is there something that industry has to do, others have to do as well? And I think it's just touching upon that. Yeah, will be.
Yeah. So there are quite a few things that can be done other than, I touched upon unpaid work, but, in order to expand and include more women into the labor force, I think one of the important things that we keep talking about is women-friendly policies to expand employment. What could be those women-friendly policies actually? Because the moment we talk about women-friendly policies, one of the important things that come up is provide women with maternity benefits, provide women with the benefits that, provide women with packages that come with ideal maternity entitlements, which is about, providing leaves to women. It is not only about maternity leave, it is also about being able to, for industries, especially the small businesses, it is very difficult sometimes to incur the cost of maternity leaves when they employ women, and that acts against or acts as a that really acts as a disincentive for enterprises to employ women. While we have legislative protections for providing women workers with their due rights on maternity entitlements, those entitlements to be implemented successfully by industries, there has to be policies which are again suitably backed by legislations or suitably backed by government interventions. And here I'm really saying that if we want, and these are things that need a start from the government, an intervention from them, where the intervention would actually be able to successfully prove that including women are not harming the enterprises. For example, what I'm trying to say is the idea that if I employ a woman and the woman goes on a 26 weeks leave after one childbirth, then that is going to incur huge costs. But if I am able to sustain that cost and keep the woman for a longer period of time and show that there is a high rate of returns by having employed that woman, those are longer term things, and those need interventions from government. What kind of interventions are we talking about? Incentivizing industries, incentivizing sectors where some amount of incentives can come in many forms, actually, providing short tax breaks, providing for employing more women, providing subsidies in some forms for including more women into their own sectors or into those industries. Now, it is not for all industries. It can be for specific industries where we do have potential of including women. Now, that is one part. The second, women-friendly infrastructure. So if we have proper wash conditions in that is water, sanitation, hygiene conditions in the office and the factory premises for women, those are actually one of the important factors which kind of helps women take decisions whether to work in that workplace or in the factory or not. Workplace safety. Now, we have legal provisions of workplace, legal provisions to back, to save women from sexual harassment at workplace. The act is there, the 2013 Act, but the implementation has to be there, successful implementation, making workplaces free from sexual violence, making workplaces free of any kind of violence, also making the commute to work seamless by providing proper safe transport facilities, continuous regular transport facilities. So there is a whole lot of gender-friendly infrastructure, women-friendly infrastructure that can be in place in terms of bringing in or attracting more women into the workforce, into the labor force. By transport, there are examples about, say, there are specific fixed time of women's, there are always specific times for commutes for office goers or factory goers. And if in those times there are, the transport facilities actually are hyped to to provide safe spaces for women, that actually helps, because otherwise women do not want to access public transport because the level of harassment, the level of violence in those public transport are often so high that one is women do not really want to travel, and second, the members of the household also do not really want women to travel in those spaces unless and until it is terribly required. So of course, one is providing women with their maternity entitlements, and the second is providing women-friendly infrastructure, women-friendly policies, the providing flexibility of timings to women, because women really prefer flexible timings for their work. So if there is a woman who has a child who goes to school and would like to really have time off from work when the child returns from school, and that may fall under the normal office hours, but if there are flexible timings, the woman can take off from that part and then add those hours later in the time when she's available for office work or productive work. So these are some of the things that can be done.
No, thank you, Sona. And I think all of these are very, very valid points. As we near the end of the conversation, one of the thoughts that's staying with me is a lot of these seem obvious in terms of what needs to be done to make it work. But the incentives in the system to make it happen across industry and government and others is really the challenge today. And I also wonder, the sequence with which we need to do this. I once went to a cement factory plant recently, and I saw that there was no, toilets for women, and a colleague of mine who traveled with me had to use a gents' toilet to be able to do it because they had just no women. So I was also wondering, in what order do these changes happen for us to make it work, for us to hit that right sequence of dominoes for it to hit. But I know that we are at the end of time, and one of the things that I'm going to go back with after our conversations, really knowing all that we know about this, how do we sequence this right so that the incentives of the market, incentives of the government, and the incentives of the individuals actually align for us to make this change happen. There is so much more that I wanted to actually discuss with you, from the point on decent work that you had maintained earlier. And I think the difficult trade-off that we often have in ensuring decent work and ensuring employment at scale for women, which I think multiple countries, even that have employed women at scale, continue to face. There is the supply side constraint. We talked about unpaid work. That's really the top of the iceberg. There is this entire conversation around agency, aspiration of women. How does it change and how has it evolved in rural and urban India? There is a conversation on the sectors themselves that I wanted to go deeper in. which only means that we definitely have to do the part 2 of this conversation at some point. But I really want to thank you for your time. It's really great to have someone who's thought so much about this issue, can bring these nuances to these conversations, highlight the possibilities and the challenges as well. And I do hope that the folks listening to the podcast enjoyed this conversation as much as I did.
Thank you so much. I hope it is useful, and I hope it is enjoyable as well.
You have been listening to Decoding Impact. To learn more about Sattva and Sattva Knowledge Institute, please explore sattva.co.in. We invite you to like, share, and subscribe to Decoding Impact so you never miss out on new episodes. Thank you for joining us.